Welcome to Midnight Grove, where every story shines a light on wonder and discovery. Tonight we bring you the heartfelt tale of the Lighthouse Keeper's Gift, a journey of courage, mystery, and resilience. Follow Marina as she uncovers the secrets of her lighthouse and learns the power of trusting herself. Let this magical bedtime story carry you into a world of light, hope, and inspiration. Chapter 1: The Island of Secrets. The island of Gannett's Reach was a world apart from the bustling mainland towns and cities across the Northern Sea. Small and isolated, the island was home to only a handful of families, their cottages scattered across the windswept cliffs and meadows. Life on the island was simple and quiet, ruled by the tides and the cycles of the sea. At its center, towering above the rest of the island, stood the Starfire Beacon, a lighthouse known for its unwavering light. For nearly 100 years, the Starfire had guided sailors safely past the treacherous rocks and swirling currents that surrounded Gannett's Reach. To the villagers, it was more than a lighthouse. It was a symbol of safety and endurance, a steady hand in an unpredictable world. For Marina, the Starfire was home, a quiet life. At 15, Marina had lived her entire life within the lighthouse's thick stone walls. Her parents had left the island when she was a baby, leaving her in the care of her grandfather, Willem, the lighthouse keeper. Willem was a large man with a booming laugh and weathered hands, and he treated the Starfire as if it were a living thing. Every lighthouse has its own soul, he often told Marina as they worked side by side. And ours is a steady one, always dependable, never faltering, just like a good keeper should be. Marina admired her grandfather, but she often wondered if she could live up to his expectations. Unlike Willem, who was bold and unshakable, Marina was quiet and reserved. She loved the rhythm of the lighthouse, the steady sweep of its light, the hum of its gears, but she rarely ventured beyond its walls. The villagers often teased her for her shyness. "Come down to the docks, Marina," they would call when she passed on her rare trips to the village. "The sea air will do you good." Marina would smile faintly and hurry on, her heart pounding. She wasn't afraid of the villagers, but their easy laughter and confident voices made her feel like an outsider. "You're not a hermit, you know," Willem would say, chuckling. "The world outside the lighthouse isn't as scary as you think." But Marina wasn't sure. The lighthouse felt safe, and the idea of stepping beyond its shadow made her chest tighten with uncertainty. The keeper's work. Each evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, Marina helped Willem prepare the Starfire for the night ahead. The process was intricate and demanding. First, they cleaned the great glass lens that magnified the light, ensuring that every surface was spotless. Then, Willem ignited the powerful lamp at the heart of the mechanism, and Marina cranked the gears that rotated the lens, sending its beams sweeping across the darkening sea. "Each light has a purpose," Willem often said as they worked. "Ours is to guide ships to safety. Without the Starfire, there'd be nothing but darkness out there." Marina nodded each time, her hands steady on the gears. She believed in the lighthouse's purpose, even if she sometimes doubted her own. One evening, as they stood together in the lantern room, Willem placed a hand on her shoulder. "Someday this will all be yours," he said, his voice steady. Marina's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "You'll be the keeper, Marina," Willem said with a small smile. "When I'm gone, it'll be up to you to keep the light burning." The thought filled her with equal parts pride and fear. She loved the lighthouse, but the idea of running it alone felt overwhelming. Instead of voicing her concerns, she nodded, her gaze fixed on the beam of light that stretched endlessly across the water. A storm approaches. It began as a faint change in the air, an uneasy stillness that made the hairs on the back of Marina's neck stand on end. The sky, once clear and blue, grew heavy with clouds that seemed to boil and churn, their edges tinged with an eerie green light. By late afternoon, the first gusts of wind rattled the windows of the lighthouse, and the sea turned restless, its waves crashing harder against the rocks. Marina watched from the lantern room, her heart pounding as the storm grew closer. "Grandpa," she called, her voice shaking slightly. Willem joined her at the window, his face grim as he took in the darkening horizon. "That's no ordinary storm," he muttered. Lightning flashed, illuminating the jagged cliffs, and the first drops of rain began to lash against the glass. The storm was unlike anything Marina had ever seen. "We need to secure the light," Willem said, his voice calm but firm. Together they worked quickly, reinforcing the machinery and checking every bolt and gear to ensure the light would hold steady. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain came down in torrents, but the Starfire's beam remained unwavering. The distressed ship. As the night deepened, Marina stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the storm rage. Lightning illuminated the sea in brief, jagged flashes, revealing waves that towered like mountains. Then in one of those flashes she saw it, a ship. It was small and battered, its sails torn to shreds, and its hull listing dangerously to one side. Marina's heart raced as she realized it was heading straight for the rocks. "Grandpa!" she cried, pointing toward the window. Willem joined her, his expression tightening as he followed her gaze. "They're too close," he muttered. "The light's not enough to guide them." "What do we do?" Marina asked, her voice trembling. Willem grabbed his coat and lantern. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll go to the cliffs and signal them." Marina grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "You can't! It's too dangerous." But Willem shook his head, his voice steady. "I've faced worse storms than this, Marina. Trust me." Before she could protest further, he was gone, disappearing into the fury of the storm. Alone in the storm. Marina stood frozen in the lantern room, the sound of the storm pressing in from all sides. The beam of the Starfire swept steadily across the sea, but it didn't feel like enough. She thought of her grandfather out there in the storm, his lantern a faint flicker against the darkness. What if something happened to him? Her chest tightened at the thought, and for a moment she considered running after him. But as she stepped toward the door, a strange sound stopped her. It was faint, almost like a whisper. but it seemed to come from the very walls of the lighthouse. Marina froze, her breath catching as the sound grew stronger. It wasn't a voice exactly, but it carried the same weight as words, gentle yet insistent, like a hand on her shoulder. "Stay," it seemed to say. "Keep the light burning." Marina's heart pounded as she turned back to the lantern. She didn't know where the whisper had come from, but she felt its meaning deep in her chest. The light was her responsibility now. Chapter 2: A Keeper's Burden. The storm raged on, the lighthouse trembling under the relentless force of the wind and waves. Marina stood alone in the lantern room, her hands gripping the edge of the console as the beam of the Starfire swept steadily across the water. Her heart pounded in her chest as she thought of Willem out there on the cliffs, his lantern a fragile flicker against the chaos. She wanted to run after him, to help him signal the ship that teetered dangerously close to the rocks. But the whisper she had heard still lingered in her mind. "Stay, keep the light burning." It wasn't a command, it was more like an urging, a quiet insistence that settled deep in her chest. Marina took a deep breath and turned her focus back to the machinery. The gears of the lighthouse groaned under the strain of the storm. But she worked quickly, tightening bolts and adjusting levers to ensure the beam remained steady. "The light has to hold," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It has to. The power of the light." The Starfire's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the storm-tossed sea in sharp, rhythmic bursts. With each sweep, Marina caught glimpses of the ship, a small, battered vessel struggling against the waves. The sight made her chest tighten. She could see figures on the deck, their movements frantic as they tried to steer clear of the rocks. But the wind was relentless, and the ship was being pushed closer to danger with every passing moment. "Come on," Marina murmured, her hands trembling as she adjusted the lens. "See the light. Follow it." For the first time, she truly understood the weight of her grandfather's words. Without the Starfire, there'd be nothing but darkness out there. The ship's survival depended on the light, and now so did Willem's. The minutes stretch on. The minutes felt like hours as Marina worked tirelessly to keep the beam steady. The storm showed no signs of letting up, its fury shaking the lighthouse to its very foundation. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the cliffs in stark, jagged lines. For a brief moment, Marina thought she saw a figure near the edge, her grandfather, holding his lantern high. "Please be okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and Marina stumbled back, her heart racing. The light wavered for a moment, the machinery groaning under the strain. "No!" she cried, rushing back to the controls. Her hands flew over the levers and gears, her movements quick and precise, despite the fear that clawed at her chest. Slowly, the beam steadied, its light cutting through the storm once more. Marina let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the console as she fought to calm her racing heart. A faint glow. As the first light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, Marina saw it, a faint glow near the cliffs. It was her grandfather's lantern, its light barely visible against the backdrop of the raging sea. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The storm had weakened, but the ship was still dangerously close to the rocks. Marina's pulse quickened as she watched the vessel struggle to change course, its battered sails flapping wildly in the wind. "Come on," she whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the console. "You can do it." The ship's crew worked frantically, their movements quick and desperate. Marina's eyes darted between the ship and the cliffs, her heart pounding as the vessel inched closer to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship cleared the rocks, its battered hull slipping into the calm waters of the harbor. Marina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her knees trembling as she sank into the nearest chair. The Starfire's beam swept steadily across the water, its light now a beacon of relief rather than warning. Willem's return. A few hours later, the storm had passed, leaving the island bathed in the soft, golden light of morning. Marina stood at the base of the lighthouse, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of her grandfather. When she finally saw him, her breath caught in her throat. Willem was making his way up the path from the cliffs, his lantern still clutched in one hand. He looked exhausted, his shoulders hunched and his steps slow, but he was alive. "Grandpa!" Marina cried, running toward him. Willem looked up, a tired smile spreading across his face. "There's my brave girl," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. Marina threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought—" "I'm all right," Willem interrupted gently, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Thanks to you." Marina pulled back, her brow furrowing. "Me? I didn't do anything." Willem shook his head. "You kept the light burning, Marina. That's everything." The ship's crew. Later that day, Marina and Willem made their way to the harbor, where the rescued ship was anchored. Its hull was battered, its sails torn, but its crew was safe, their faces etched with gratitude as they greeted the lighthouse keepers. "Your light saved us," the ship's captain said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were sure we'd be dashed against the rocks, but that beam guided us to safety." Willem nodded, his expression steady. "That's what the Starfire is for," he said simply. The captain turned to Marina, his eyes warm. "And you, miss, thank you. You have no idea how much your work means to people like us." Marina's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Willem, unsure of how to respond. But her grandfather gave her a small nod, his eyes shining with pride. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. A keeper's responsibility. That evening, as the sun set over Gannett's Reach, Marina stood in the lantern room, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered in her chest, a strange mixture of fear, relief, and newfound determination. Willem joined her, his movements slow as he adjusted the machinery. He was clearly tired, his hands trembling slightly as he worked, but his eyes were steady. "Grandpa," Marina said hesitantly. He turned to her, his expression soft. "What is it, my girl?" Marina hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Do you think I'll ever be ready?" To run the lighthouse, I mean. Willem smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. You're already ready, Marina, though you just don't know it yet. Marina's chest tightened at his words, but she nodded, her gaze returning to the sea. The Starfire's beam swept steadily across the water, its light a constant reminder of the lighthouse's purpose and her own. Chapter 3: The Whispering Light. The days after the storm passed in a quiet hum of activity on Gannet's Reach. The battered ship remained anchored in the harbor while the villagers worked together to help repair its torn sails and splintered hull. Marina and Willem visited often, bringing tools and supplies from the lighthouse. The ship's crew was grateful, their captain especially so. He was a tall, weathered man named Captain Rowan, his beard streaked with silver and his eyes full of gratitude whenever he looked at Marina. "You've got a steady hand and a brave heart," he told her one morning as they worked side by side to repair a torn mainsail. "The light wouldn't have held without you." Marina flushed at his praise, mumbling a quiet, "Thank you." Willem, standing nearby, chuckled softly. "You've earned it, Marina. Take the compliment." Marina smiled faintly, but her thoughts lingered on his words. She had kept the light burning, and the ship had been saved. But the whisper she had heard in the lantern room still echoed in her mind, filling her with questions she couldn't ignore. The whisper returns. That evening, after the day's work was done, Marina climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the lantern room. The Starfire stood quiet and still, its great glass lens catching the last light of the setting sun. Marina ran her hand over the polished surface, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns etched into the metal. The whisper hadn't come back since the storm, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Where had it come from? And why had it sounded like it knew her? As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Marina lit the lamp at the center of the mechanism, cranking the gears to send the beam sweeping out across the sea. The rhythm of the light was steady and soothing, and Marina found herself relaxing as she worked. But then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it, the whisper. It was faint at first, almost like a sigh carried on the wind, but it grew stronger as Marina froze, her breath catching in her chest. "Marina!" The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it carried a weight that made her heart race. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The whisper didn't answer, but the light of the Starfire seemed to brighten, its beam stretching farther across the water than ever before. A guiding presence. Marina's first instinct was to run, to escape the eerie pull of the whisper, but something rooted her to the spot. The whisper wasn't threatening, it was steady, almost comforting, like a hand gently guiding her forward. Gathering her courage, Marina stepped closer to the light. The whisper grew clearer, its voice blending with the steady hum of the machinery. "You are the keeper now," it said, its tone gentle but firm. "You must protect the light." Marina's chest tightened. "I don't understand. Protect it from what?" The whisper didn't answer. Instead, the light flared brightly, illuminating the room in a warm golden glow. Marina shielded her eyes. her heart racing as the whisper faded into silence. When the light dimmed to its usual steadiness, Marina stood alone in the lantern room, her thoughts spinning. A visit from Captain Rowan. The next morning, Marina shared the experience with Willem as they worked together to clean the lighthouse windows. Willem listened carefully, his brow furrowed in thought. "A whisper, you say?" Marina nodded. "It felt alive, like the lighthouse was trying to tell me something." Willem was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "The Starfire has always been special, Marina. It's saved more lives than we can count, and it's been here long before either of us. Maybe it knows more than we do." Marina frowned. "But why me? Why now?" Before Willem could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Captain Rowan, his expression serious as he stepped inside. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, his voice steady. "Not just for the light, but for the work you've done since the storm." Willem smiled warmly. "You're always welcome, Captain. Gannet's Reach takes care of its own." The captain hesitated, his gaze shifting to Marina. "There's something I wanted to ask you," he said slowly. "That light of yours, it's different, isn't it?" Marina's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "For the night of the storm," Rowan continued, "it wasn't just the beam that guided us. It was something else. Like the light was alive, reaching out to us." Marina exchanged a glance with Willem, her thoughts racing. "Perhaps it's just the magic of the Starfire," Willem said lightly, though his tone carried an edge of curiosity. But Marina wasn't so sure. The mystery deepens. That night, Marina climbed to the lantern room alone. She lit the lamp and cranked the gears, sending the light sweeping across the dark sea. The routine was familiar, almost comforting, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The whisper had returned once. Would it come again? Hours passed, and the night grew darker, the stars above glittering like diamonds against the velvet sky. Marina stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The lighthouse was quiet, its steady hum blending with the sound of the waves below. Then, just as she was about to turn away, the whisper came again. "Marina!" Her breath caught, and she stepped closer to the light. "I'm here," she said softly. The whisper seemed to wrap around her, its presence warm and steady. "The light is more than a guide," it said. "It is a protector, and so are you." Marina's heart pounded. What does that mean? But the whisper faded, leaving her alone with the steady sweep of the light. A keeper's duty. In the days that followed, Marina couldn't shake the feeling that the Starfire was trying to tell her something. The whisper's words echoed in her mind. The light is more than a guide. It is a protector, and so are you. She threw herself into her work, learning everything she could about the lighthouse. As history and its role in guiding ships, she spent hours in the lantern room, adjusting the machinery and studying the patterns of the light. Willem watched her with quiet pride, but he said little. "You're ready," he told her one evening, as they stood together in the lantern room. Marina glanced at him, her brow furrowed. Ready for what? Willem smiled faintly. To take the next step, whatever that may be. Marina didn't reply, but her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and determination. The lighthouse had always been her home, but now it felt like something more. It felt like a calling. Chapter 4, Shadows in the Fog. Autumn deepened on Gannet's Reach, painting the island in shades of gold and crimson. The air grew cooler, carrying the crisp tang of salt from the sea, and the nights lengthened, cloaking the lighthouse in longer hours of darkness. For Marina, the change of seasons brought a new rhythm to her days. She had grown more confident in her role as the lighthouse keeper, her hands steady as she worked the gears and polished the great lens. Willem had begun to leave more of the responsibilities to her, content to watch from the sidelines. As his granddaughter stepped into the role he had long prepared her for, but even as Marina settled into her duties, the mystery of the Starfire weighed heavily on her mind. The whispers had returned several times since the storm, each one urging her to protect the light. But from what? A quiet warning. One evening, as Marina stood in the lantern room, cranking the gears that sent the Starfire's beams sweeping across the darkened sea, the whisper came again. It was faint at first, a soft hum that seemed to blend with the steady rhythm of the lighthouse's machinery. But as Marina stilled, straining to hear, the whisper grew clearer. "Danger approaches," it said, the words low and steady. The light must not falter. Marina's heart raced. "What kind of danger?" she asked aloud, her voice trembling. The whisper didn't answer, but the light of the Starfire flared, its golden beam cutting through the night with an intensity that sent shivers down Marina's spine. She turned to the window, her gaze scanning the horizon. The sea stretched out before her, dark and endless, but there was no sign of danger, no ships, no storms, nothing that could explain the whisper's warning. Still, the unease lingered, a stranger on the shore. The next morning, Marina set out early to check the lighthouse's perimeter. The storm weeks ago had left some of the exterior battered, and Willem had asked her to survey the damage before they began repairs. The air was crisp and cold as she walked along the cliffside path, her boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. The sea below was calm, its surface shimmering under the pale morning light. But as Marina rounded a bend in the path, she froze. There at the base of the cliffs was a figure. It was a man, his dark coat billowing in the wind as he stood near the water's edge, staring out at the horizon. Marina's heart pounded. The island rarely saw visitors, and the sight of a stranger was enough to unsettle her. "Hello," she called, her voice cautious. The man turned slowly, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to study her with an intensity that made her take a step back. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and even. "I didn't mean to startle you." Marina hesitated. "Who are you?" she asked. "How did you get here?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a traveler," he said. "I arrived on a fishing boat yesterday." Marina frowned. The villagers hadn't mentioned any new arrivals. "What are you doing here?" The man's gaze drifted to the lighthouse in the distance. "Admiring the view," he said simply. "It's a remarkable structure, isn't it? So steadfast, so enduring." Marina felt a chill run down her spine. "I should get back," she said, taking a step away. The man nodded. "Of course. I won't keep you." But as Marina turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Be careful, Marina," he said softly. "Not all lights are meant to shine." Marina's blood ran cold. When she turned back, the man was gone. A warning ignored. Marina returned to the lighthouse, her thoughts racing. She told Willem about the encounter, her voice trembling as she described the man's unsettling presence. "A stranger, you say?" Willem said, his brow furrowed. Marina nodded. "He knew my name, Grandpa. And he said, not all lights are meant to shine." Willem's frown deepened. "I'll speak to the villagers," he said, his tone firm. "If this man's still on the island, we'll find out who he is." But the villagers had no answers. No fishing boats had arrived in recent days, and no one had seen a man matching Marina's description. "It's probably nothing," Willem said later, though his voice carried a note of unease. "Just a drifter passing through." But Marina wasn't convinced. "The fog descends." That night, a thick fog rolled in from the sea, swallowing the island in a dense silvery haze. The beam of the Starfire cut through the mist, its light steady and unwavering, but the atmosphere felt heavy and oppressive. Marina stood in the lantern room, her hands gripping the edge of the console as she stared out into the fog. The whisper's warning echoed in her mind. Danger approaches. The light must not falter. She had never felt so alone. A test of faith. Hours passed, and the fog grew thicker, muffling the sound of the waves and cloaking the island in eerie silence. Marina worked tirelessly to keep the light burning, her hands moving over the controls with practiced precision. But as midnight approached, the whispers returned. "Marina!" She froze, her heart racing. "I'm here," she said softly. The whisper was stronger now, its voice filling the room. "The light is your strength," it said, "but it is also your burden. Protect it, Marina. Protect it with all you have." Marina's chest tightened. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before the whisper could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the lighthouse. Marina whirled around, her eyes darting to the staircase. Footsteps. Someone was inside. An unseen threat. Marina's breath caught as the footsteps grew louder, echoing up the narrow spiral staircase. Her mind raced, her thoughts flashing back to the stranger on the shore. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The footsteps paused, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a low, chilling laugh echoed through the lighthouse. Marina's blood ran cold. She turned back to the light, her hands trembling as she adjusted the gears. The whisper returned, its voice urgent. "Do not leave the light," it said. "Do not let it falter." The footsteps resumed, growing louder and closer. Marina's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to focus. The Starfire's beam swept steadily across the fog, its light cutting through the darkness like a blade. Stay strong, she whispered to herself. Just stay strong. The keeper's resolve. As the footsteps reached the top of the staircase, Marina turned to face the intruder, her hands clenched at her sides. But when she looked, the staircase was empty. The whisper filled the room once more, its voice steady and calm. You are stronger than you know, Marina. Trust in the light. Marina's heart slowed, her fear replaced by a quiet determination. She turned back to the console, her hands steady as she worked the gears. The fog began to lift, the first rays of dawn breaking through the mist. The Starfire's beam continued its steady sweep, its light unwavering. And as the island awoke to a new day, Marina stood in the lantern room, her chest filled with a quiet sense of purpose. Chapter 5. The Lightkeeper's Legacy. The morning after the fog lifted, the island of Gannett's Reach was unusually quiet. The villagers went about their routines with a wary sense of calm, their voices hushed and their movements slow. At the lighthouse, Marina stood in the lantern room, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The whisper had gone silent again, leaving her with more questions than answers. The memory of the footsteps haunted her. She had heard them, felt them climbing the spiral staircase. But when she turned, no one was there. "Who are you?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "And why are you trying to reach the light?" The Starfire's beam swept steadily across the sea, its golden glow unwavering. It was a comforting sight, but it wasn't enough to dispel the unease that lingered in Marina's chest. The stranger's warning. Later that day, Willem found Marina sitting on the rocks near the cliffs, her knees drawn to her chest as she stared out at the water. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice gentle, as he lowered himself onto the rock beside her. Marina didn't look at him. "I'm worried, Grandpa," she admitted. Willem frowned. "Is this about the stranger?" Marina nodded. "And the whispers. And the footsteps. Something's happening, Grandpa. I can feel it." Willem's expression darkened, but he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "The Starfire has faced storms, wars, and worse, Marina. It's still standing, and so are we." Marina glanced at him, her brow furrowed. But what if the stranger was right? What if not all lights are meant to shine? Willem shook his head firmly. "Don't listen to that nonsense. The light is meant to shine, Marina, and so are you." A gathering storm. As the days passed, Marina couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The weather remained calm, but the air carried an undercurrent of tension, like the breath before a scream. One evening, as Marina stood in the lantern room, preparing the Starfire for the night, she noticed a change in the light. The beam, usually golden and steady, flickered faintly, as though the lamp was struggling to hold its strength. Her chest tightened. "Not now," she murmured, her hands flying to the controls. She adjusted the gears, polished the lens, and checked the fuel, but the flicker persisted. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was enough to unsettle her. As she worked, the whisper returned. "Marina!" She froze, her heart pounding. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The light is in danger," the whisper said. "You must protect it." Before Marina could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the Starfire's beam flickered again, its golden glow dimming. The stranger returns. A knock at the lighthouse door startled Marina from her work. She descended the spiral staircase, her steps quick and light as she reached the entryway. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. The stranger from the shore stood before her, his dark coat billowing in the wind. His pale face was calm, but his eyes held an intensity that made Marina's skin crawl. "You again," she said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "What do you want?" The stranger tilted his head slightly. "I came to warn you." "Warn me about what?" "The light," he said simply. "It is not what you think it is." Marina narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" The stranger's gaze shifted toward the lantern room, his expression unreadable. "The Starfire is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. Its light draws both those who seek safety and those who seek destruction." Marina's chest tightened. "Who are you?" The stranger smiled faintly. "A traveler," he said. "Nothing more." Before Marina could respond, the stranger turned and disappeared into the darkness, his figure swallowed by the night. The Starfire falters. As the night deepened, Marina returned to the lantern room, her thoughts racing. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. The light draws both those who seek safety and those who seek destruction. What did he mean? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden creak of the machinery. The gears groaned, and the Starfire's beam flickered again, its light dimming before surging back to life. Marina's heart pounded as she rushed to the controls. The lamp was burning steadily, but something felt wrong. The whisper returned, its voice urgent and commanding. "Do not let it falter," it said. "The light is your strength." Marina nodded, her hands trembling as she worked to steady the beam. The storm weeks ago had tested the lighthouse, but this felt different. This felt like something she couldn't see, a shadow pressing against the edges of her mind. The shadow in the light. Hours passed, and the Starfire's beam continued its steady sweep across the sea. Marina sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The whisper had gone silent again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As the first rays of dawn broke through the darkness, Marina noticed something unusual. The light of the Starfire, which usually dimmed with the rising sun, remained steady, its golden glow bright against the pale sky. Her chest tightened as she stood, her hands gripping the edge of the console. "What's happening?" she murmured. The whisper returned, its voice low and steady. "The light is a guide, but it is also a shield. Without it, the shadows will come." Marina's breath caught. What shadows? Before the whisper could answer, a sudden chill filled the lantern room. Marina turned, her eyes darting to the staircase. For a moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows, a pale, gaunt face watching her from the darkness. But when she blinked, it was gone. The Keeper's strength. As the days passed, Marina worked tirelessly to keep the starfire burning. The flicker persisted, but she refused to let it dim. The villagers noticed her determination, their voices filled with gratitude whenever they spoke of the lighthouse. "Ah, you're a true keeper," Captain Rowan told her one evening. "The island is lucky to have you." But Marina wasn't sure she believed him. The starfire was her responsibility, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was failing it. One night, as the light flickered again, Marina heard the whisper for the final time. "Marina!" She froze, her hands trembling. "I'm here," she said softly. The whisper seemed to wrap around her, its presence warm and steady. "The light is not just the starfire. It is you. Trust yourself, Marina. You are the keeper, and you are enough." Marina's chest tightened, tears filling her eyes. She had always doubted herself, but the whisper's words filled her with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. A new dawn. When the sun rose the next morning, the starfire burned brighter than ever. The flicker was gone, replaced by a steady, unwavering beam that stretched far across the sea. Marina stood in the lantern room, her hands steady on the controls. For the first time, she felt truly at home in her role as the lighthouse keeper. The starfire was her responsibility, but it was also her legacy. And as the light swept steadily across the water, Marina knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for joining us at Midnight Grove for the Lighthouse, Keeper's Gift. Marina's journey reminds us that even in the darkest moments, a steady light can guide us home, and sometimes that light comes from within. As you drift off to sleep, may you find comfort in the steady rhythm of hope and the quiet power of self-belief. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you again for another enchanting tale